Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, "You are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power."
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off by thanking you loyal listeners yet again for joining us this weekend. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, May 30th, 2026. Our theme today is Black Exile, as we'll be diving deep and charging those revolutionary batteries for yet another Saturday. We begin with a radio relay coming to us from Prison Radio as the one and only Mumia Abu Jamal speaks to us about the work of the legendary Fanon and his perspective on the problem with one of my personal favorite books, Black Skin, White Mass. Then we get right into things as our very own treasure trove of wisdom, author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne, is being joined on the line by Gregory Vargo, associate professor of English at New York University and editor of the volume, Ira Aldridge, On the Stage, in Anthology. After that, we'll hear from Baba Mumia Abu Jamal yet again to pay tribute to a lesser-known but profound and important author, revolutionary, and political prisoner by the name of Khaled Raheem, who recently made his transition. Then, in the second half of our program, Dr. Horne will be joined on the line by Russell Rickford, Associate Professor of History at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, and author of the book of Proxy Africa, Guyana, African Americans, and the Radical 1970s. Lastly, we want to pay small tribute to the life and work of legendary jazz saxophonist Sonny Rollins, who passed away on May 25th at the age of 95. Enjoy some of his music throughout the program and enjoy an extended play following our two interviews. Now I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now. KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org streaming live on the web. To make sure we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Talib Kweli, Modern Jazz Quartet, Wayne Shorter, Miles Davis, and Sonny Rollins. Now, people, get ready for this train coming, taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for these words from none other than Mumia Abu-Jamal, followed by an interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Gregory Vargo.
Here's the problem with black skin, white masks. In my study and read and reflection of black skin, white masks, and then The Wretched of the Earth, A Dying Colonialism, and other works by Fanon, I find that the man who wrote Black Skin, White Masks is not the man who wrote The Wretched of the Earth. Why do I say that? I say that because, you know, scholars have shown that Black Skin, White Mask was supposed to be his doctoral thesis. His advisors, who were doctors, who admired his remarkable brilliance, talked him out of that. And he did like a standard doctoral thesis on a medical problem and a psychological problem, right? But the man who wrote Black Skin, White Masks was a man wrestling with himself. He writes in that book, "What do I care about black nationalism? That's not me. I am a Frenchman. My culture is French. My language is French. France," this is a quote, a direct quote, "France is my religion." I can hardly repeat that word, repeat that line without laughing, because it's so preposterous when you read The Wretched of the Earth. Because he is another man when he writes The Wretched of the Earth. He is no longer a Frenchman. He speaks French because that's his, you know, the language of his youth and of his education. But in his mind, he is a combatant against the French Empire. When he wrote Black Skin, White Masks, he was what he would call a colonized subject, right? He said Martinicans went to France, you know, almost like, for them, it was almost like going to heaven. Except when they met French people, they learned that they weren't who they thought they were. Because the French are the French, and you're either one of them or not. And if you're coming from their colonial possessions, you are not regarded as French, especially if your skin is dark, or you're brown or black or yellow when you think about it. So the consciousness that wrote that was the tortured consciousness of a colonized subject. When he broke out of that, when he was on his way to medical school in Lyon, in France, on the French equivalent of the GI Bill, his mind was exploded by a child who looked at him, and the little boy looked at his mother and said, "Mama, mama, un nègre. Mama, mama, a nigger." And it blew his mind. And he was never the same. And he writes about that in Black Skin, White Masks. He said, "My body was shattered into 1,000 pieces. And I tried to pull it all together, but it was a new me pulling it all together." And he was traumatized. You know, his dream of what he thought France was not. And when he went to Algiers and he saw how his fellow doctors and psychiatrists treated the Algerian people, he knew what side he was on. You know, he not only tried to transform that medical system in Algiers, he joined the FLN. And he worked underground, but he taught them how to survive torture. And, you know, and he treated torturers. It's in The Wretched of the Earth, you know, his medical files. So this extraordinary man, you know, was not the same man. So read Black Skin, White Masks with that knowledge and that caution, and it will speak to you.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Gregory Vargo, Associate Professor of English at New York University and editor of the volume Ira Aldridge on the Stage, an Anthology. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Gregory Vargo.
Thanks very much for having me.
So who was Ira Aldridge, and why did you decide to publish a book about him?
Well, Ira Aldridge is an amazing person with an amazing story. He was the first Black British theatrical star, a New Yorker by birth. He moved to England in 1824 and spent the better part of the next 4 decades touring Britain and ultimately Europe. And he rose to fame as one of the greatest actors of his age. And all of this at a time when major events are rocking the British Empire. A massive slave rebellion in Jamaica in 1830-31, the abolition of slavery, the rise of transatlantic abolitionism, but also the rise of pseudoscientific racisms. So he's a young man performing in Britain, kind of at this very charged moment. And inevitably, his career and his success get drawn into debates about slavery, abolition, Black liberation, and racist pseudoscience. He's also an artistic genius, a real pioneer of the theater who adopts a more realistic, restrained acting style that dominates the stage even today, and that really doesn't kind of come fully into its own until the end of the 19th century. So decades before Aldridge was kind of carving that path. I was drawn to Aldridge through research on the relationship between protest campaigns and the theater. And he's just an amazing life story, and I want his work to be more fully known.
So you mentioned that he rose to prominence during a charged age, particularly debates, transatlantic debates, with regard to slavery and equality. Could you elaborate on that point?
Yes. So Britain abolishes slavery in 1833/1838. There's kind of an interregnum period. And then, of course, abolition comes to America later. but many Britons are involved in the debate over slavery and abolition. And what really strikes me about Aldridge's corpus is it offers a very different version of Black liberation than what white abolitionists typically promoted. Abolitionist writing in the 19th century often cast enslaved people in the role of patiently suffering innocents, people worthy of philanthropy and the gift of freedom, kind of the Uncle Tom archetype. But Aldridge's plays foreground the agency of enslaved people in their own liberation. And they think about, a huge variety of forms of resistance, from what the scholar James Scott calls the weapons of the weak, daily acts of disobedience and recalcitrance, to fugitivity, to revolutionary violence. And his works are really giving a hearing to the question of the ethics and the politics and necessity, potentially, of militant resistance. And that isn't much of a part of abolitionist discourse in Britain. Maybe has some say in the United States, but still he gives a kind of very challenging version in this corpus of plays that he returns to again and again.
So he was also a stage director. What contributions did he make in that field?
Yeah, he was a real innovator. He kind of confronted the problem of a white culture industry and a kind of an elite culture industry that wanted to cast him in very few roles, kind of, maybe a dozen Black parts. And he kind of pushed against these trammels by eventually acting in plays of non-Black characters. Like he played Shylock, he played King Lear, and a variety of other parts. He was a Shakespearean actor, among other things. But he also developed kind of his own formats where he would create excerpts of many scenes from different plays, and he would mix these on lectures about the theater and about politics. And so he kind of performed in a wide variety of plays, like including minstrel dramas, but his lectures contextualized those and made people see the problematic aspects of them. So less is known about him as a director, but he was a significant innovator in that regard too.
So talk to us about the African Grove Theater in New York City, to which he had an affiliation and which drew protests. Elaborate on that. Yeah,
so the African Theater, or the African Grove Theater, it's kind of renamed a couple of different times, was the first Black theatrical company in the United States. And it faced racist harassment. White theater owners contributed to it kind of losing its license. There were protests there. And it's a kind of vision of how charged theater could be for 19th century people. Though, even today, of course, we see many censorship debates and in a new way in recent years. But recognizing kind of the limited opportunities for acting in the United States for a gifted young Black performer, Aldridge decides to move to England in the early 1820s. And he certainly encountered racism in England as well, but he was able to carve a path probably with kind of different possibilities.
So he spent a lot of time acting in Eastern Europe and Russia. As I recall, he died in Poland. Do you have any reflections on his experiences there, particularly his experiences in comparison to those in the United States and Great Britain?
Yes, it was another way that he kind of was a pioneer and did amazing experimental work. He would act in mixed language productions, though in Germany, he actually performed one play in German as he spoke kind of moderate German, but in the others, he would speak in English, and other performers would speak in the language native there. And in many ways, we get the best theatrical reviews of him in these other places. He was less likely to be considered kind of only a novelty because of his race. And so you can learn a lot about his style by reading those reviews. He had a different corpus. It was overwhelmingly Shakespeare there, whereas he's performing in Britain. He performed in many kind of slavery melodramas, minstrel plays, along with Shakespeare and Restoration tragedy.
Now, elaborate on his pro-anti-slavery stances, his pro-abolitionist stances.
Yes, well, Aldridge came to speak more and more forthrightly and directly on the issue as he became a kind of more prominent star. Frequently, on the last night of a performance run, the kind of theatrical industry was he would visit a town as a touring actor and perform for a week or a few weeks. So on the last evening, he would give a lecture, and it would include pro-abolitionist and anti-racist sentiments. He might read abolitionist poetry from local poets. But the corpus of his works, too, are overwhelmingly, they're all abolitionists to some extent, though they're sometimes mixed, and the works can kind of at points portray stereotypes, but at others kind of explode those stereotypes they articulate.
Finally, Gregory Vargo, editor of the volume Ira Aldridge on the Stage, an Anthology. What would you say is the legacy of Ira Aldridge?
Yeah, he has a really important and large legacy. He gave his name to 4 semi-professional or amateur acting troupes in the United States in the early 20th century. He was a predecessor for other African-American actors, particularly in Shakespeare, like Paul Robeson's Othello, and others. He shifted the conversation about race and abolition in Britain, and had a demonstrable effect on those politics. And he anticipated the theatrical style that has dominated the stage from the late 19th century until today.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
Khaled Raheem makes his transition. The name Khaled Raheem may not ring many bells, but to those who knew him, his life was one of lifelong struggle for the black nation as a revolutionary, as a Muslim convert, and as a prisoner deeply enmeshed within Pennsylvania's mass incarceration system. Raheem was also a skillful writer whose 2021 book, Panthers That Make Salat, recounts the struggles of former members of the Black Panther Party who struggled in prison across the state from the early 1970s to the mid-1980s. They faced repression, beatings, long-term lockdowns, and onerous sentences. Raheem typified the deep influence of Malcolm X upon Panther and other black revolutionary groups who embraced Islam as he did. Raheem wrote of days of rebellion, resistance, of revolutionary resistance as a Panther and also a political prisoner at Holmesburg, at Greaterford State Prison, Huntington State Prison, Waymart State Prison, and back to Greaterford, known in the old days as the Farm. As he did time for robberies to bring resources to revolutionary movements, as he would say, he saw the emergence and expansion of what we now call mass incarceration. He was young and therefore receptive to the rebelliousness and passions of youth. Naturally, under prison's inherent repression, he rebelled, and rebelled constantly. He got thrown into the hole, he got transferred to other prisons, and lastly, he was transferred to Western, a penitentiary in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. There he met old heads from Holmesburg and Greaterford. He continued to try to utilize his political teachings as a Panther and his spiritual teachings as a Muslim. He spent over a decade in the joint. He was released in 1984 and later settled in Pittsburgh, where he worked on peace initiatives among street gangs. He founded the New African Independence Party there. I didn't know him as Raheem, but I did know him as a member of the Black United Liberation Front in Philadelphia, the BULF, led by former Panther captain Reggie Shell. In fact, I met him at BULF headquarters on Columbia Avenue when he was known as Bird. He was as thin as a minute, with a youthful face and a laugh that bounced off the walls. That youthful face lives in memory. Khaled Raheem, revolutionary, writer, believer, and community organizer and activist, returns to the source with love, not fear. This is Mumia Abu Jamal. These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela. News 24, South Africa, and Press TV, Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Russell Rickford, Associate Professor of History at Cornell University and author of the book Proxy Africa, Guyana, African Americans, and the Radical 1970s. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Russell Rickford.
Thanks so much for having me. Delighted to be here.
And we're delighted to have you. So why did you produce this book?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I guess first and foremost, I should acknowledge that I'm Guyanese. I was born in Guyana in 1975. In fact, right in the midst of the time that I'm discussing in this book. But beyond that, sort of intellectually and politically, my interest has been Black internationalism and Black radicalism. And so I came to discover that my native Guyana actually played a really important role in terms of African-American internationalism and progressive or left visions of Pan-Africanism and global struggle in the 1970s. So I was fascinated with that and discovered, what I call Guyana's golden age of Pan-Africanism, roughly between 1970 and 1980.
Now, Los Angeles plays a role in your story insofar as in 1969, quite famously or infamously, there were killings on the UCLA campus in the context of a struggle over Black studies. Mm-hmm. And an accused or the accused fled to Guyana. Tell us more about that story.
Yes. Well, so this is one of the African Americans in the book that wound up fleeing to Guyana, largely because of Guyana's very generous asylum policy. Forbes Burnham, the prime minister at the time, had basically welcomed any African American refugee, seen as political refugees or racial refugees fleeing repression or racism in the United States and really throughout the global North to resettle in Guyana. Forrest Burnham was very interested in positioning Guyana as a kind of beacon of global solidarity with connections both to Black power and a kind of multiracial third worldism. And so one of the, or at least two actually, of the men convicted of being involved in that shooting, that infamous shooting at UCLA in 1969, wound up fleeing to Guyana. And for at least one of them, it was not actually a happy experience. Larry Watani Steiner, who was a member of the US organization, the cultural nationalist organization that was involved in a deep political feud with the Black Panther Party, was one of the men who fled to Guyana. But he was an activist, and he is an activist at heart, and he actually wound up speaking out against the growing authoritarianism in Guyana, right? So in some respects, he went from the frying pan to the fire and ultimately ended up fleeing the Burnham regime later in the 1970s as well. So which really sort of reflects the arc of the story, because the book begins with the sort of growing promise in the late 1960s and particularly in the 1970s of Guyana in the eyes of many Pan-Africanists in the United States and across the diaspora. And by the end of the book, there's a real sort of disillusionment with Guyana, particularly in the context not just of the Jonestown tragedy in 1978, but especially the assassination of Walter Rodney, the famous dissident, the left Pan-Africanist, the author of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. That assassination in 1980, many people around the world saw the Burnham administration as complicit in Rodney's assassination. Rodney had been a fierce advocate of democracy and multiracialism and the civil rebellion against the regime. And so that event in 1980 really kind of confirms Guyana's decline and the sort of loss of this mystique of a kind of Pan-Africanist socialist haven in the Western Hemisphere.
Now, Guyana is sited in South America, as we know, and it is a predominantly English-speaking nation in light of the fact that it had been colonized by the British, and therefore it's oftentimes grouped with Jamaica, Barbados, and the Caribbean nations, despite being sited in South America. And you mentioned Forbes Burnham, and for a number of years, he was perceived, at least, as a leader of the African population in Guyana. And on the other side was Cheddi Jagan, of South Asian ancestry, the leader of the People's Progressive Party, which as early as 1953 had sought to lead Guyana to a kind of independence, invoking interference by the British colonizers, including the United States of America. So tell us more about these men and the forces that they represented.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Well, I mean, I should say from the beginning that this whole experience, the whole process of writing the book has been an education for me, even though, as I said, I was born in Guyana. I grew up here in the United States and came to history mainly through my focus on African-American radicalism. So I've sort of in the process of refashioning myself as a Caribbeanist, but in just delving into Guyanese history, a fascinating, rich history, but also a very tragic history in a lot of ways. I mean, as you said, Guyana was a site of one of the most powerful anti-colonial movements, and its leaders included Cheddi Jagan, who was a Marxist-Leninist and very much aligned with Moscow, and also Forbes Burnham. Forbes Burnham was Afro-Guyanese, and Cheddi Jagan was Indo-Guyanese, and their alliance was part of this multiracial, leftist, internationalist, very inspiring anti-colonial movement beginning in the late 1940s and in the 1950s. And part of Guyana's tragedy is the subversion of imperialism, basically of Anglo-American imperialism, of London and Washington collaborating to subvert this very powerful working class, based anti-colonial movement in Guyana. And ultimately, Forbes Burnham is able to prevail and is seen by many progressives throughout the world and certainly in the diaspora, including leftists in the United States, such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson and others. Now, Forbes Burnham is sort of seen as an opportunist who basically appeases Western interests in order to prevail over Cheddi Jagan and lead Guyana into independence in 1966. So the early part of the book is really about Burnham's efforts to shed this stigma of collaborationism with empire and to sort of rebrand himself as a progressive on the global stage, even as he refashions Guyana as a kind of third world stronghold. And he's able to do so quite successfully, in part because of some of the people he has around him, some of the allies in the United States. And among the most important allies, at least into the early 1970s, was a man named U.C. Guyana, who's still living. Mr. Guyana is, I think, near 100 at this point. But he's one of the most important figures in terms of the anti-colonial movement but also the Black consciousness movement in Guyana. And so UC Guyana launches in the 1960s a cultural revolution that first catches the attention of African American progressives, but it's then Burnham in the early 1970s through his nationalization policies, his support for Southern Africa, that sort of puts Guyana on the map as a third world and Pan-Africanist mecca of sorts.
How many African Americans wound up migrating to Guyana during this period?
That's a really good question. I don't know for sure. Some of them were, more visible than others, but many African Americans ended up playing some role with the Burnham government, working for the state in one way or another. So there were prominent people like Julian Mayfield, the writer, and also Tom Feelings, the artist. And both of these men, and in fact other African American immigrants who wound up spending substantial periods of time in Guyana, were expats in a kind of earlier iteration. They were Afros, they were African American expats in Ghana, in West Africa, which actually has a very close history with Guyana. So in some ways, this was kind of a second act for people like Tom Feelings and Julian Mayfield in terms of their internationalism, in terms of resettling overseas in a site that's seen as a kind of Pan-Africanist mecca, and in terms of their commitment to contribute to a nation-building project in what they saw as a progressive land.
Now, one of the more prominent Black American migrants to Guyana was Herman Ferguson. And he, if I'm not mistaken, wound up becoming a major in the Guyanese military, which some perceived as controversial. Tell us more about Herman Ferguson.
Yeah, well, Herman Ferguson is a really fascinating figure. He sort of came to political consciousness in part because of Malcolm X. Herman Ferguson was an activist in Queens and struggling against segregation in the building trades and sort of derisive cultural depictions of African Americans in murals in Queens. But then he becomes a Malcolm X aide, and then his radicalism deepens, his internationalism deepens. He plays a role both in the Republic of New Africa and the Revolutionary Action Movement. And he basically, his radicalism draws the attention of authorities, and in a very sort of dubious case, he's charged with plotting against moderate civil rights leaders. Essentially, he has to flee the United States, and he winds up in Guyana in the early 1970s. And after some time, his spouse Yalua also joins him in Guyana, and they play important roles, both in the sort of educational reform movement. Herman Ferguson was also an assistant principal back in New York City, and continues in terms of work in education and in the context of Guyanese efforts, basically to decolonize the public schools. But he also plays a role in the armed forces of Guyana, as you say, and rises to a fairly high rank. I mean, which is remarkable in some ways. I mean, it both shows Herman Ferguson's commitment and the commitment of many African American expats to genuinely contribute to nation building projects. And I mean, I think that's part of the context of the internationalism in the 1970s. So often we sort of equate the 1970s with the decline of 1960s radicalism, and that can obscure all of these fascinating and important internationalist efforts. Herman Ferguson actually ultimately returns to the United States in the 1990s. So an important, I think, takeaway from the book is that, despite the promise of nation building in the third world, I think many African American progressives and internationalists collided with some of the inherent limitations, the problems of the post-colonial nation state and perhaps nationalism itself. Herman Ferguson ultimately comes back to the United States because he believes that this is where his fight lies, even though he spends such a huge portion of his life, many years, almost 2 decades, I believe, in Guyana. He comes home to be with his family and to resume the fight for African American liberation at home. So it's not a story about which battlefront, the home front or overseas is more important. It's really a story of this sort of complex balancing of these strands of radicalism in the 1970s, the nationalism, the internationalism, the Pan-Africanism, the leftism, all of which converge in these complicated ways in Guyana during the 1970s.
Now, possibly the most well-known aspect of Guyanese history, to some in our audience at least, might be the tragedy in Jonestown. Therein, and others recall that Reverend Jones of San Francisco led his flock to Guyana, and there was, depending on who you read, either mass homicide or mass suicide. What do you have to say about Jonestown?
Yeah, well, so Jonestown has always been a challenge for me because, listen, I'm writing about Guyana in the 1970s, and very few people in North America know anything about Guyana. But if they do know something about Guyana, overwhelmingly it's the Jonestown reference. And it's not so much that people know a lot about Jonestown; it's just that they have a kind of a cultural image about Jonestown, and much of that can be summed up in the phrase, the regrettable phrase, actually, don't drink the Kool-Aid, right? And don't drink the Kool-Aid, really, what that means is that the victims of Jonestown, the over 900 people that died, mostly Americans who died in Jonestown in this act of, it's a kind of strange blend of mass suicide but also homicide in 1978, that these people are sort of mindless sheep, that they were dupes. And so Jonestown has become a sort of metaphor for just sort of a kind of mindless groupthink. And I argue in the book that that's a real problem. It's a real, I think, obfuscation of the realities of the rank and file folks who wound up going to Jonestown and dying in Jonestown. I mean, the first thing I would say is that many of those victims were Black people, right? So that Jim Jones was able in Northern California, where his People's Temple ultimately was headquartered, to attract lots of Black folk and people of color, in large part because he was very shrewdly drew upon some of the contemporary political themes of the day, the rhetoric of the Civil Rights Movement and the rhetoric of Black Power, but also some of the ideas about a third worldism, right? So he drew on these ideas about a practical transition to socialism, the allure of cooperativism, right? There's a deep cooperative tradition in Guyana. In fact, Guyana was the first cooperative republic, right? So formerly the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. So Jim Jones mobilized a lot of these themes to help both draw people, including many African Americans, to his church, to his ministry, ultimately to persuade them to resettle in Guyana. So this ends horrifically in 1978 with this mass suicide. But I make the strong case in the book that we should see Jonestown, if not akin to the sort of larger Black internationalism, these sort of Afro-diasporic tendencies that I'm talking about in the book, but certainly having a kind of deep cross currents, right, with these ideas. And so dismissing, the victims of Jonestown just as dupes, I think really elides the politics. Okay, I'm not trying to oversimplify Jonestown. Jonestown is a complex and a disturbing event, but there are these deep elements of Black internationalism, and if we put Jonestown in the context, at least it helps us to see the African American victims of Jonestown as more culturally legible and not simply as sort of mindless pawns or sheep.
Finally, Russell Rickford of Cornell University, author of the book of Proxy Africa, Guyana, African Americans in the Radical 1970s. What's next on your research agenda? What do your eager readers have to look forward to?
Well, that's a great question, and it's a humbling question coming from you, Professor Horne, who has always been one of my real mentors and influences, and of course, I'll never catch up with your record and influence. But I mean, so there's a number of different things I'm thinking about. I mean, at the moment, I have to sort of choose. I've always been fascinated with African American cooperative movements, and there's an African American cooperative movement in the 60s and 70s that I think that would be worthwhile to write about. There's some good books on African American cooperativism. I have been thinking about Palestine, obviously, for some time, and especially in the context of the ongoing genocide. I'd love to write about that. I think one of the topics that's fascinating me at the moment, and it's absolutely, I think, a result of the kind of despair of our current political moment, is the question of utopias, right? And Black utopias or African American utopias. And I think partly why this topic fascinates me, even though my research is just beginning, is not so much the question of escape, is escaping from our current political realities, but again, something akin to what Robin Kelley calls freedom dreaming, and the power of imagining a dramatically different alternative, right? And what that can mean in terms of shaping, inspiring our sort of very concrete day-to-day organizing. So yeah, those are some directions in which I could go.
Well, you have at least one reader in myself whenever these projects emerge, Russell Rickford. But thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much, Gerald, and thank you for your example, brother.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with Gregory Vargo, Associate Professor of English at New York University and editor of the volume Ira Aldridge on the Stage, an Anthology. We also thank Russell Rickford, Associate Professor of History at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, and author of the book A Proxy Africa, Guyana, African Americans, and the Radical 1970s. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Word to producer Sister Tej. Shout out to Prison Radio and the legendary Mumia Abu Jamal, of course. Special shout out and thanks to our spiritual backbone, Freedom Now founder and ancestor Babadidan Kamati. Abundant thanks to our marvelous engineer. And last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org. And that's not all. Go to the audio archives on kpfk.org, scroll down to Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. With that, we send you off, and until next Saturday here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.